Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished marketer from Colorado, USA, Mr. Chris Rubin. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ashutosh. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Chris is the Chief Creative Officer of BrandMultiplier.ai. So, Chris, before we talk Brand Multiplier, can you talk a little bit about your own journey in brand strategy and what motivated you to enter this field?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for asking. Story has been big in my life. It sort of started growing up around attorneys and English teachers, sort of stoking my love for reading and storytelling, started very early. And this shaped a lifelong fascination with how narratives can resonate emotionally. This idea of moving people was really exciting to me and has remained that way throughout my life. By the time I was about age 7, I was getting really into computers and technology. I was programming text adventure games in BASIC and continuing my explorations with language. And, I was just so thrilled with that first experience of the machines doing my bidding, if you will. So that was an exciting sort of milestone. And then I decided to stick with human language versus computer language. And so I pursued Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and combined that with some interest in brains and psychology. And all of this sort of started to deepen my understanding of the power of emotional resonance and storytelling. And then right after college, I got a job as a copywriter at a small agency, and just lucky place and time. The first accounts I ever worked on were Disney and Hard Rock Cafe right out of the gate. And so, yeah, just pure luck, really. And I just fell in love with this idea of a brand as a vehicle for story. And just fascinated by what goes into building and sustaining a brand that generates love and loyalty across generations. And then eventually I moved to Silicon Valley in the late 2000s and immersed myself in the world of tech brands telling their stories. I knew people at Google and HP and Intel, and I witnessed that breakthrough with neural networks and AlexNet in 2012. And for me, this brought everything full circle. This was weaving together language and technology, brand and story, brains and machines. And so then, of course, November 2022, we all got our hands on GPT 3.5. And within a few weeks, I knew finally that AI was finally officially going to revolutionize not just my business, but any business that was sharp enough to integrate it efficiently and effectively. And so that's what I focused my business around, is helping small to medium-sized businesses pursue and deploy enterprise-grade strategy and creative by integrating AI and doing it at a fixed monthly cost, and specifically in the marketing stack.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. Thank you. That's quite an amazing journey you've had. So let's talk about BrandMultiplier.ai. What are some of the core principles of effective branding that you have discovered after you've discovered AI?
Sure. Well, those principles of branding I discovered, over 30 years ago. With my first brush with those major brands who were so well funded, right? Traditionally it's required so much money and time and human resources to develop a brand like that. But what's at the root of any really strong and successful and persistent brand? I would say there's probably about 10 things. I'll just highlight a few. The first one is authenticity. The brand has to be genuine and true to its values. This is about fostering trust and again, emotional connections. I'm going to talk about emotional resonance probably a lot today, because I feel like that is at the heart of what makes a brand gain traction and then build loyalty and love and affinity that I mentioned earlier. So authenticity, probably number one. Within that, and number two, following on that, is consistency. The brand message and the experience has to be consistent across all touch points and interactions. This ensures that it's recognizable and reliable, but you can also see how that continues that process of building trust, right? Consistency builds trust, just as authenticity does. Next, I would mention differentiation. You have to clearly distinguish the brand from competitors by highlighting what's uniquely valuable about the brand and what it has to offer. And this helps you stand out in a crowded market. And then next, of course, I'm going to come back to emotions, emotional connection,
Mhm.
the brand identity, the know thyself quality of the brand. It has to resonate emotionally with the target audience. And again, this is about trust,
Right.
loyalty, advocacy. There's a few more. I guess the one more I'll mention is the customer understanding. If you're going to create content of any kind as a writer, as I believe you are, Ashutosh, rule number one is know your audience, right? And so you have to deeply understand your target audience's needs, desires, their pain points. And the way I like to think about this is, it really is as simple as this. As a brand, you have something to offer, and obviously that offering has value.
Right.
The key with finding your audience is finding the audience that is most likely to benefit from what you have to offer.
Right.
Once you identify that group of people, then you find a way to convey that value through narrative and story in a way that resonates emotionally with that benefit that they stand to gain.
Right.
And so that, I think, encapsulates really the whole game.
What a
when it
great
comes to
response.
brand.
What a great response. Thank you. And given the amount of experience you have with branding, what, in your view, are some of the common branding mistakes several companies tend to make?
Sure. Well, it's sort of like the inverse of all those things that I just mentioned, right? So inconsistency, right? Inconsistent branding, a lack of a clear value proposition, if that's muddled or gray in any way, ignoring the target audience, just sort of charging boldly forward just because the C-suite thinks something is important. As an example, usually the C-suite is the one in charge. Overcomplicating the message, not boiling it down to its most concise and again, emotionally resonant version. Neglecting the brand experience. Perhaps you have a great offering, but you forget to make sure that it translates all the way down to every touch point, including if you're standing in line for an experience at a theme park, for example, or waiting in line at a restaurant. What is that experience like? It's all important. As soon as they're within your brand environment, it all matters. And then I'll just I have to ask, not differentiating from competitors.
Well said.
Again, that's a big problem.
I agree. And Chris, with your background in linguistics, how do you leverage language to enhance a brand's message?
Thanks for that question. I love this one because this is just so close to my heart. And there's a lot to this. I'll try to be as concise as I can. First is about the unique brand voice. And this is really about, you have to have a very sharp and deep adeptness and agility with language. You have to have a broad understanding of vocabulary. And within that, not just knowing a bunch of words, but understanding nuance of tone and again, emotional resonance, right? Certain words evoke certain emotions with certain types of people. And that is not true with other types of people. So there are cultural components. So that's the first one. And then, linguistic techniques like phonetics. So phonetic appeal is around things like alliteration, rhyme, rhythm. This is a way to make language more engaging, and often it's subconscious, right? But if you hear something that's catchy and easy to remember, you know it, right? And a lot of times that's because of phonetics. Another example is semantic framing. Framing the brand in a positive light and aligning that with the desired brand image. Words like innovative, trusted, sustainable, those evoke specific associations. And so having that adeptness and agility with language is so important. And then just within linguistics, I have to mention psycholinguistics. So these are essentially emotional triggers, words and phrases that evoke positive emotions, create a strong emotional connection. And then this one I love that is so often overlooked, which is cognitive load. There is a load on our minds and our brains, on our neural circuitry when we confront language. And to minimize that cognitive load is like a secret superpower when it comes to messaging. If you can reduce that cognitive load and make it as easy as possible for the audience to process and remember your message, that message is more likely to resonate and to stick with it.
Well said. A few minutes back, you were talking about how artificial intelligence came into your life 2 or 3 years ago, when it did in all our lives, Chat GPT 3.5. How do you see technology, and within technology, the role of artificial intelligence impacting the future of branding?
Yeah. This is big. I mean, in full candor, Ashutosh, my goal for a little over a year now is to try to carve out and own the intersection between brand strategy and AI. And so this question, it really just gets right to the heart of it. There are so many examples, and I encourage any of our listeners to check me out on LinkedIn. I continue to put out articles with sort of some thoughtful perspectives on a lot of this, and also some comprehensive guides for leaders of SMBs that are interested in this question of how can I gain value from AI without taking too much risk. But I'll mention a few. So personalization is going to be huge. And I think just right off the top, it's obvious how personalization can be valuable, right? The more personal something is in general, the more relatable it is, the more likely I am to associate positively with it, to engage further with it. So hyper-personalized experiences, AI can enable brands to do that by analyzing massive amounts of customer data, and then tailor recommendations and personalized messages and bespoke product offerings that resonate deeply with subsegments of that target audience that was never before possible. Even at the global agencies with multi-million-dollar budgets, you could never get down to this level of hyper-personalization. And then dynamic content creation, also in the category of personalization, sort of generating personalized content, hyper efficiently, even in real time. As an example, in some near future, there will be a version of a website page that you visit, Ashutosh, regarding a product or a service. And in real time, it's going to customize the content based on knowledge that it has about you. Now, that might sound a little bit creepy, and there are some privacy concerns, but I do believe that there will be a line to walk that keeps out of the creepy zone and still stays in its place where it's offering a higher level of value. Another quick one would be enhanced customer insights. So back to combing through those massive volumes of data, you can understand your customer at a much deeper level. Things around sentiment analysis, analyzing social media and product reviews and online content to gauge customer sentiment at scale, and to begin to generate some insights based on that large analysis, and then figure out how that translates over to your specific segments of that audience. Some other just quick examples, I won't go into detail, but improving customer engagement, creative automation, so idea generation. I encourage your audience to never accept what these tools give you and just publish it. But in terms of idea generation, using it as I always use the analogy of a hyper ambitious intern. Think of these tools in that way and assign it a role, give it a project, be very prescriptive with your guidance, and then never accept what it gives you the first time or the second time or the third time or the fourth time. I playfully talk with my kids about, I use the term wrestling. I feel like all day long, every day, I'm wrestling with these machines to try to get the best outcome that I can get. But ultimately, it's about having a human in the loop who has expertise and emotional intelligence to try to make sure that the output is maximally valuable. I think that's a good sort of overview.
So let's talk a little bit about brand positioning. And brand positioning is always very critical. I'd love to get your perspective on brand positioning and how do you help your clients determine how to position their brands?
Yeah, so important, as you said. It's crucial. So first, let's define it. Right? For non-brand nerds, I like to think of brand strategy as two basic layers. The first one is brand identity, and that boils down for me as know thyself. If anyone's ever done any work in the personal growth space, it's the same thing. You have to start by knowing who you are before you can begin to grow and develop. And then the next layer on top of that is positioning, and that is know your audience. And also, by the way, know your competition. So defining how your brand is perceived in the minds of customers relative to competitors. And so I think it's clear why that would be important, right? To create a unique identity and value proposition that distinguishes your brand in the marketplace. So this really comes down to differentiation, customer perception, target market focus, and strategic direction. And so we put all those things together. Essentially what we're doing is, helping to define that position. That is, what we're really trying to do is carve out a niche within the marketplace that the brand can own, dominate, and expand over time. And so to the question of how do we do that for our clients, first, it starts from a place of understanding. We have to understand the market and the competition. So we do a deep dive on the market landscape, trends, behavior, customer behaviors, economic factors, and then a competitive analysis. Key competitors, their positioning, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are their market strategies?
Right.
And then within the target audience, demographics, psychographics, all that stuff, of course, creating very highly detailed customer persona profiles, which again AI can be really helpful with these days in creating those things far more efficiently and based on much larger data sets. So richer detail and sort of more verifiable and deeper foundation for those personas.
Well said.
Then we determine and crystallize the unique value proposition, right? What is that offering that we know is the most concisely worded version of the thing that the brand is producing and putting out into the world and trying to market? And then ultimately, this all ladders up to a positioning statement. And that boils down to clarity, must be clear and concise to articulate that unique brand value proposition. And then components within that. So that's the target audience, that's the category or market that the brand operates in, the brand's unique benefits, and perhaps most importantly, the reasons why those benefits matter to that audience.
Well said. And, once you've determined the kind of positioning that you want, then comes the whole aspect of what is the story you want to tell.
That's right. Well, I would argue actually first we have to test and validate that positioning. And then once it's verified and maybe adjusted, now we're going to implement, as you say. And so we want to develop that story that encapsulates that value proposition. I love the term strategic narrative because it is a story that does a job. And the job is what I mentioned earlier, conveying that value to the target audience that's most likely to benefit in a way that resonates with them emotionally.
And once you've done got your story right,
yes,
what is the process to communicate the brand's values to potential customers?
Sure. Well, the values are incorporated into the narrative already. So the strategic narrative has sort of soaked that in and then translated it into something that probably isn't specifically speaking to the values, right? But it's conveying those values through narrative. And then it's about, I think you're asking about deployment essentially, and that is about first identifying the platforms on which that target audience is most likely to reside and engage. And then taking that core strategic narrative and iterating that for each platform with the nuances that are relative to the platform and that subsegment of the audience that's on that platform. So as a quick example, if your audience is on LinkedIn and they're on Facebook and they're also on Instagram, your strategic narrative is going to sound and look a little bit different across each of those platforms based on those characteristics of those platforms, among other things.
Well said. So, Chris, I have time for two more questions. My next question relates to culture. And, you live in one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. What impact do cultural differences have on branding strategy?
Yeah, that's really important with working with global clients, as I've done a fair amount. First I have to say, just to confirm what you're saying, understanding and addressing those cultural differences is absolutely essential for entering multiple markets and then for continuing to sustain a presence in multiple markets. I think, there's probably 5 or 6 main pillars here. I would say the first one is consumer behavior and preferences. Cultural norms and values influence customer behavior. And that includes purchasing decisions, brand loyalty, product usage. What a product might be used in a completely different way, in India or Africa or England than it is in America. And so buying habits and then also preferences, features, packaging, advertising styles, colors, all of these have different meanings and significance depending on the culture. So you have to take all of that into account. And then another big one, of course, is communication style, right? First off, language. You have to do localization and translation. Again, AI can be hugely helpful with this in terms of efficiency. But there's nuance in language with idioms and local expressions, and you have to be really careful to avoid misunderstandings. There was a classic story about, I believe it was Ford that was trying to market the Nova in Latin America. And they didn't realize that Nova translates to doesn't go, Nova. And they spent millions of dollars having to, after they figured it out too late, trying to rework the campaigns, and I'm not sure if they ever changed the name of the product, but so nuance in the tone and style. There's cultural symbols and meanings. You've got values and norms. You've got different marketing channels and media usage. So there's really a raft of things to take into account, and it's a brand is well advised to be sure that they take this take this quite seriously when working in a global scale.
Great response. Thank you. And my last question to you, Chris, what branding trends are you most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people might just feel obligated to say AI here, and that's actually not what I would say, because in my opinion, AI is the power is in the process and the workflow.
Yeah.
It's not so much about the output.
Yeah.
So to your question, branding trends I'm most excited about right now, I would say that the idea that is still not yet delivered on fully is personalization and hyper-personalization. I think that's really interesting, but it still has to be proven out. I think purpose-driven branding is really probably important and growing in popularity once again. It feels like this is one of those, everything is sort of cyclical, right, Ashutosh? Yeah. And this is something that gained prominence in the 60s and 70s, and then kind of faded out a little bit with the greed era. And now it feels like the Gen Z, millennials, the Zoomers, they're bringing it back around. And it's kind of funny because they, as all younger generations do, they believe that it's something that they've come up with themselves, right. This idea of corporate social responsibility or social impact. But purpose-driven branding, of course, it helps create a deeper emotional connection, and it demonstrates a commitment to something outside of capitalism and profitability. I think that's really important. And the last thing I would say is that with AI creating a deluge of mediocre content, I think this is when narrative-driven content that is driven by skilled storytellers, people who have deep experience with emotional intelligence and storytelling, at scale, and then incorporating multimedia formats. I think this is a really exciting time, especially when you combine the previous point around purpose-driven branding and this idea of deeper narrative-driven content. I think that is the future for thoughtful brands.
Amazing. And on that note, and your three wonderful thoughts about the future of branding that you're excited about, which is hyper-personalization, purpose-driven branding, and narrative-driven content. Thank you, Chris, for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for speaking to me about BrandMultiplier.ai. We covered a lot of ground on different aspects of branding, marketing, strategy. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Ashutosh.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.